What's going on, everyone? Week 13 officially in the books with the conclusion of Monday Night Football last night. And you know what time it is. I've got my top weekly waiver wire pickups for you, specifically week 14. And this is it, everyone. Crunch time. Fantasy football playoffs beginning for the majority of us. So again, I've got a top 20 list of guys you should be targeting. So let's get right into it. Starting at the quarterback position, let's go to a name that we're all familiar with, and that is Josh McCown of the Jets, because he lit it up. 331 yards, 1 passing touchdown, and then 2 rushing touchdowns on top of that. And now this week, he gets the Denver Broncos. And look, the Denver Broncos have been a shell of themselves this entire season. At this point, they're becoming a favorable matchup. That's how bad it's been. And the Jets, believe it or not, have a chance at the playoffs at this point in this weak AFC conference. So I say go ahead, roll with Josh McCown. That offense has been on a roll lately, and versus a struggling Denver defense, you can rely on him yet again this week. Next, a guy that probably hasn't been on this list of waivers all year, but regardless, Tom Savage of the Texans has an incredible matchup this week versus the 49ers. In terms of waiver wire pickup matchups at the quarterback position, probably the best one out of anyone this week. And look, he just came off of 365 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception, and versus a very friendly 49ers defense, especially to opposing quarterbacks, there's no reason to think that he can't at least duplicate what he did or even better it. So if you're desperate at the quarterback position, as crazy as it seems, Tom Savage, not a bad pickup this week. Next, a name that a lot of us thought would be done in terms of fantasy relevance this year, but Eli Manning back from the dead with these front office firings for the Giants. So he's being reinserted as the top guy. And look, I think versus this Dallas defense, it will get Sean Lee back, but regardless, Eli Manning, guy has a lot of pride. I think he's going to come out, and I think he's going to play very well. I think he's going to be very motivated. He's still got his weapons with Sterling Shepard, Evan Ingram around him, and even with Sean Lee, that Dallas defense isn't that scary. Divisional game, these two teams know each other well. I think Eli is going to come out, perform well, and give you a decent starting performance. And finally, rounding off the quarterbacks, Jimmy Garoppolo. And look, I had him last week on my list of guys, and again, I think you should, if he is available, make a move for him, because he did come off a game, just 300 yards, no touchdowns and an interception, but it was versus his stingy Bears defense, his first start for the 49ers, and I think he got probably a lot of the rust out, a lot of the lingo down. So now this week he gets the injury-riddled Houston Texans team on defense, on offense. And look, this is a pretty decent matchup actually. If you need a streaming guy, Jimmy Garoppolo, he's quickly finding his favorite targets, he's mobile, and he can exploit matchups. I think a decent start in fantasy this week. Go ahead, invest a pick in Jimmy G moving forward as well. Now getting to the running back position, and this is actually a week where there's some incredible talent to be had off of waivers, and if you need a guy for this week, and not only this week but moving forward, this could be the week to make that splash. So let's start with a guy in Gio Bernard who took over for Joe Mixon last night, who looked like he got concussed. Initially looked pretty serious, don't know the severity, but might be safe to say that he'll miss next week. We don't know. But this is the stat line for Gio Bernard. 13 carries, 77 yards, 2 receptions, and 19 yards to add. So as far as his usage, he was definitely seeing it. And Gio Bernard, we've always known he has been a good pass catcher. He was originally pretty much the Joe Mixon before Mixon got there. And with the usage that we were seeing in the running game for Mixon, I think it's safe to say Gio Bernard will have another decent go at it. He gets the Bears defense, but look, you can have success versus them. I think he could be a decent ad, especially in PPR leagues. Next, a guy in Aaron Jones of the Green Bay Packers, who a lot of us probably went ahead and might have dropped while he was dealing with his injuries, and maybe in favor of Jamal Williams, his backup, who has been killing it since. But look, Aaron Jones finally healthy, and he had 1 carry, and it did take until overtime, but that 1 carry was the game-winning 20-yard touchdown for the Green Bay Packers, and I think that is something to be appreciated by the front coaching staff. So I do think, especially versus the Cleveland Browns, that Aaron Jones might regain a lot of his carries, might start seeing a split backfield. So for a lot of you Jamal Williams owners, Aaron Jones, not a bad name to pick up for a handcuff. And for others, if Jones does regain his starting role to some degree, because it was his before his injury occurred, not a bad name to look after going forward this week. Next, a guy in Kerwynn Williams who again took advantage of an injury, this time in Adrian Peterson, and had a decent performance, 16 carries, 97 yards, and this week gets the Tennessee Titans. And you would think the Cardinals, again, this is going to be dependent on if AP is out, would rely on the running game to take pressure off of Gabbert. And again, in standard leagues, I would say go ahead, take a flyer on Williams. He should be running back 2, flex kind of appeal. And again, that is if Adrian Peterson sits out. Moving right along, Peyton Barber of the Tampa Bay Bucks. And look, a lot of people, including myself, had the wrong Buck last week to add in Jaquiz Rodgers. Instead, it was Peyton Barber who got the start, and in dominating fashion, he went for 23 carries for 102 yards, and on top of that, 4 receptions for 41 yards in the absence of Doug Martin. And the thing is, Doug Martin has been struggling all year for the most part, and so has that running game. And I would think with Peyton Barber providing this spark, the Bucks are going to ride the hot hand and go ahead and give him another chance to start. Wouldn't surprise me at all. So go ahead, invest a pickup in Peyton Barber. He gets the Detroit Lions. We saw Alex Collins of the Baltimore Ravens have success versus them. So matchup wise, I think Peyton Barber can as well. If he is available, go ahead, place a waiver wire pickup for him. Next, a guy in Mike Davis of the Seattle Seahawks, where Seattle has been looking for their main running back all year. Seemed to be Chris Carson, but obviously with the injury wasn't the case. And since then, it's been a carousel. But the other night, Davis really seemed to separate himself. In terms of carries, it wasn't even close. He dominated. 16 carries for 64 yards and then 4 receptions for 37 yards. And I do think Seattle will ride the hot hand. Now, they do get a tough matchup versus the Jags, but look, as far as matchups go, you can make the argument that the Eagles presented a similar situation, and Davis still had a nice stat line, so I do think he could have a nice performance again. And again, if you are desperate at the running back 2 position or the flex, I would say Mike Davis this week, and especially moving forward, a name to target and to know. And finally, I actually have 2 names to keep in mind here at the last spot, with Theo Riddick and Tion Green of the Detroit Lions. And this will be predicated a lot on if Amir Abdullah can suit up or not. Also, if Matthew Stafford can play or not. You would think that if he's not 100% and he plays, they're going to use the running game to alleviate some pressure. And they have a favorable matchup versus the Tampa Bay Bucks. So keep that in mind. As far as who to add and in what format, Theo Riddick is the PPR guy. Tion Green is the standard guy. Riddick came off of 9 carries for 21 yards and a touchdown and then 5 receptions. And Green came off of 11 carries for 51 yards and a touchdown. So pretty much splitting carries, but each one excels in a little bit something different. Green maybe a little bit more of that red zone threat, whereas Riddick, again, more of that reception kind of threat. So keep these 2 names in mind as the week goes forward and the status of Amir Abdullah becomes more clear. These can be 2 names to go after hard as this week progresses. Moving on to the wide receivers, let's start with Jermaine Kearse of the New York Jets, who's coming off 9 receptions for 157 yards in that offensive explosion versus the Chiefs. And look, the Jets do have the Denver Broncos this week, and that defense does have some playmakers. Aqib Talib will be back, but look, you would think that Talib would match up with the number 1 guy in Robbie Anderson, so I do think Jermaine Kearse can still have a big game. McCown does like to take shots downfield, and the Jets, believe it or not, are still in contention for a wild card spot. I think Jermaine Kearse has become a nice 1B option to the 1A that is Robbie Anderson, so I would go ahead and invest a pick in him this week. Next, Danny Amendola of the Patriots, and look, he didn't have the best performance, only 2 receptions for 34 yards this last week, but the big picture here is the fact that Rob Gronkowski suspended for 1 game. Obviously, he's going to appeal, but I do think the suspension will get upheld. It was a pretty rough hit that he put on the Bills. So for that reason, I do think Amendola becomes a nice play. Someone will have to take over the yardage and the receptions that Gronk accounted for. I think Amendola is not a bad name to target. Friendly matchup versus the Miami Dolphins. Go ahead, invest a pick in Danny Amendola if you're looking for a wide receiver 2 or flex guy. And finally, wrapping it up with 2 receivers on the 49ers. That's right, go figure. All of a sudden, the 49ers offense has some guys that should be targeted, and I really do believe with Jimmy Garoppolo in there, both these guys are viable options. First, Marquise Goodwin. He was featured last week, and in case you didn't take a gamble on him, I would say definitely do it this week, especially moving forward. He is the main option for Jimmy Garoppolo. But right behind him, Trent Taylor. He had a nice stat line, 6 receptions for 92 yards. Both guys finished with 90 yards, so you definitely see that Jimmy Garoppolo was targeting them. Nice matchup versus the Texans this week, and I would go ahead, prioritize Marquise Goodwin. But if you're looking for a guy that potentially could make a splash, Trent Taylor, especially in PPR leagues, he was getting a lot of targets. Go ahead, put in a waiver wire request for either of these guys. Now looking at the tight end position, and there is still something left to be desired here. Not the best week in terms of tight ends, but starting with, regardless, Cameron Brate of the Bucs. And look, with Jameis Winston coming back, Cameron Brate was his main guy. In the red zone, he was looking for him, and he caught both of his touchdowns. I do think he does prefer Brate a little bit over O.J. Howard. I will say O.J. moving forward, I do see good things coming for him, but right now, Cameron Brate versus the Lions, not a bad play. He did come off 2 receptions, 39 yards, and those 2 touchdowns. So if you're looking for a guy, and especially if you're a Gronk owner, Cameron Brate, not a bad guy to target. Continuing right along, we have Austin Seferian-Jenkins of the Jets, and go figure, but we have had now several Jets players on the quarterback, receiver, and now tight end level, but that is just what it's been this year. Both for the Jets offensively, who have put together some solid performances, but more so versus the Broncos, who have struggled that much, and especially versus the tight end position. And for ASJ, it seems like he's been getting robbed several weeks now of would-be touchdowns. A couple weeks ago was versus the Panthers, and then we all know the one versus the Patriots. So I will say he is getting targets, he is getting red zone targets. The Broncos struggle versus the tight end. Go ahead this week if you need a tight end. ASJ, not a bad guy to keep in mind. And finally, we have David Njoku of the Cleveland Browns, who is coming off one of his best games with 4 receptions for 74 yards and a touchdown. Now, I do think a lot of that was helped with Josh Gordon being reinserted in the lineup, really opening things up for the other guys. And I will say, he gets a friendly matchup this week versus the Green Bay Packers, who have been giving up points in bunches, and on top of that, they have injury issues in that defense. So I will say, I do think with Josh Gordon back on, Njoku benefits from that. Decent matchup, so go ahead, invest a waiver wire pickup in Njoku. Again, if you are one of those Gronk owners, not a bad name to keep in mind. Now, finally getting to the defenses, wouldn't be a true waiver wire video without these guys. Let's start with the Cincinnati Bengals, who I think have one of the best matchups this week versus the helpless Chicago Bears. And the reason I say that is because the Bears are absolutely atrocious offensively. And look no further than this. Right now, the Bears, in terms of their wide receivers, going forward, projecting into the last week of the NFL, are not expected to have a single 500-yard pass catcher, which is completely insane to think of in this day and age, especially with how teams pass the ball. And that just speaks volumes in terms of their quarterback, in terms of their coaching staff not wanting to air out the ball, in terms of erring on the side of caution. And for that, to me, spells a low-scoring game, which is always nice defensively. I think that makes them more one-dimensional. The Bengals are going to be able to focus in on the running game, and when the Bears are forced to pass it, I think the turnovers will come. So Cincinnati, a really nice play this week. Next, the New York Jets defense, and look, it seems like this is the New York Jets video because we've almost had them on every single level. But still, they are a good matchup this week because they face the atrocious Broncos offense who just can't figure things out. And they just had a complete collapse versus the Miami defense. I think assuredly they can have similar problems versus the Jets, who have a good front seven, and I think can put pressure on whoever the quarterback is there. So New York Jets, not a bad play this week versus the Broncos. And finally, the Green Bay defense versus the Cleveland Browns. And look, the Green Bay defense, they're obviously not a stout unit. They're not a top 5 unit, but this is more so Cleveland Browns than anything because that offense has been struggling all year. And it starts with Deshaun Kaiser. You know, he's just still very young, still mistake prone. And I do think the Green Bay Packers will come out with a passion here. And the reason is Aaron Rodgers is set to come back next week. If they can get this win, that's going to set them up well nicely to contend for an NFC wildcard spot. So look for the Green Bay Packers. A decent matchup this week. Could be a nice sleeper. So with that, we wrap up our Week 14 waiver wire pickups. Let me know, what did you guys think? Are there names that I missed? Names that you agree on? If you have any questions at all, let me know in the comments section as always. And if you enjoyed, like, subscribe, and I will see you guys in future videos.